Jerome Attaway had spent 15 years building something most people would never see because he never let them. A logistics company, 12 properties, a net worth his own wife couldn't accurately guess. He drove a used truck, wore no jewelry, and kept his finances behind a wall of deliberate invisibility, because he'd learned early what money does to the way people love you. For 5 years, he believed Adrienne was different. Then he found an email she accidentally sent to the wrong inbox, a message to her mother, casual and unashamed, mapping out a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what Jerome was worth. He didn't explode. He didn't confront her. He got quiet. The kind of quiet that in Jerome Attaway meant something was already in motion. He waited for the right evening, sat across from his wife at their own dinner table, and told her he'd lost everything. He watched every trace of warmth drain from her face in seconds. And when she slapped him, open palm, hard, Jerome touched his jaw once, looked her directly in the eye, and said, "Thank you. That's all I needed." She had no idea what she'd just confirmed. She had no idea what was already coming. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning sun was just starting to peek over the horizon as Jerome Attaway sat on his back porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands. The house behind him was nice enough, 4 bedrooms, good bones, solid construction, but nothing that screamed wealth. That was exactly how he wanted it. He watched a pair of cardinals flit between the bird feeder and a nearby oak tree, their bright red feathers catching the early light. The simple wooden porch furniture had been his own choice, just like everything else about this deliberately understated home. No marble countertops or crystal chandeliers, nothing flashy that would make people look at him differently. Jerome took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the quiet moment before the day truly began. Growing up poor in Memphis had taught him lessons that stuck, even after building Attaway Logistics into a company that cleared $4.2 million just last year. Money changed things. Money changed people. He'd watched his father get taken advantage of too many times by folks who smiled to his face while reaching for his wallet. So Jerome kept his success invisible. The 12 properties he owned across 3 states were all held under an LLC that his wife Adrienne had never bothered to ask about. He drove a used truck that was practical but unremarkable. No fancy suits, no flashy watches, no obvious signs of wealth that would make people treat him differently than who he really was. The memory of meeting Adrienne at that charity gala 5 years ago drifted through his mind. She'd stood out immediately, not just for her beauty, but for the way she'd seemed genuinely interested in him as a person. While other women at these events usually angled for hints about his finances, Adrienne had asked about his dreams, his vision for the future. She'd listened intently as he described wanting to expand the logistics company into new markets, nodding with what seemed like real understanding. "Tell me more about the challenges," she'd said that night, leaning in closer. "What keeps you up at night when you think about growing the business?" Jerome had fallen hard and fast. Here, finally, was someone who saw him, really saw him, beyond whatever he might have in the bank. But lately, something felt off. Small changes in Adrienne's behavior had caught his attention. Her spending had increased steadily over the past few months. Nothing outrageous, but noticeable. More designer clothes, more expensive lunches out, more impulse purchases that she used to consider carefully. More concerning were her questions about finances. After years of seeming uninterested in the business details, she'd started pushing to be added to his investment accounts. "We should really combine everything properly," she'd said last week over dinner. "It's what married couples do." And then there were the conversations about his long-term plans, brought up casually but with increasing frequency. Questions about retirement strategies, about his vision for the next 5 or 10 years, about what kind of lifestyle he imagined for their future. Jerome set his coffee cup down on the small table beside him. For 3 weeks now, he'd been quietly observing, letting his wife's words and actions paint a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. He hadn't said anything yet, hadn't confronted her, just watched and listened with the same patient discipline that had helped him build everything he owned. Standing up, Jerome collected his coffee cup and headed inside to his home office. He needed to check the shared email account he'd set up for household bills. As he opened his laptop and logged in, the morning light filtered through the window, casting soft shadows across his desk. The screen lit up with new messages. Jerome scrolled through them slowly, his expression remaining neutral, even as his eyes fixed on something unexpected. For a long moment, he sat completely still. The kind of stillness that comes from years of learning to control your reactions when the stakes are high. Then he closed the laptop with a quiet click. His face revealed nothing as he sat back in his chair, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. Whatever he had just discovered in that email account, it confirmed something he'd been hoping wasn't true. The next morning's sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the wooden table where Jerome sat, his laptop open before him. His first cup of coffee had gone cold, untouched, as he read the email for what must have been the 10th time since discovering it yesterday. The message sat there in black and white, accidentally forwarded to their shared household account when Adrienne had meant to send it to her personal email. The timestamp showed she'd written it to her mother, Brenda, just 3 days ago. "Mom, things are moving along like we discussed. I'm working on Jerome about the investment accounts. You know how he is about keeping things separate, but I think I'm wearing him down. Once I get access, we can move forward with the next phase. Troy says timing is everything, and he's right. I've got Jerome exactly where I need him. He still doesn't know anything. He's too trusting. That's always been his problem." Jerome's fingers hovered over the touchpad, scrolling back up to read it again. Each word felt like a small cut, precise and deliberate. The casual tone of Adrienne's message somehow made it worse. This wasn't written in anger or frustration. This was strategic, calculated. The mention of Troy's name stood out like a flashing warning sign. Jerome had heard that name before, just once, when Adrienne was on the phone last month. She'd quickly ended the call when Jerome walked into the room. At the time, he'd dismissed the flutter of concern in his gut. Now, reading the easy familiarity in how she referenced him, that moment took on new meaning. Setting his jaw, Jerome clicked through the email chain, looking for more context. The previous messages were mundane, discussions about lunch plans, complaints about the weather, but now even those felt tainted. How many other conversations had happened outside this account? How long had this been going on? He closed the laptop with a quiet click that seemed too gentle for the weight of what he'd just confirmed. Standing up, Jerome moved to the coffee maker with mechanical precision, going through the familiar motions of measuring grounds and filling the water reservoir. The routine helped him think. The house was silent. Adrienne had left early for her weekly tennis lesson, blissfully unaware that her careful facade had cracked. Jerome watched the coffee drip steadily into the pot, his mind already shifting from shock to analysis. This was how he'd built his business. When problems arose, he didn't react emotionally. He gathered information, he planned. By the time the fresh coffee was ready, Jerome had already pulled out his phone. He scrolled to Dwight's number and pressed call, knowing his friend and attorney would be at his desk by now. Dwight picked up on the second ring. "Jerome, what's up?" "I need to tell you something," Jerome said, his voice steady. "My wife is planning to leave me once she gets access to my accounts. She's working with someone named Troy. She told her mother I'm too trusting, and she's right. I was." The line went quiet for a moment. Dwight had never hidden his reservations about Adrienne, but he'd kept them respectful, never wanting to overstep. Now his response was immediate and focused. "Tell me what you need. First, I need to know everything," Jerome said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "But before we make any legal moves, I need to understand if this was real at first, if she loved me and it turned into something else, or if this was always the plan." "How do you want to find out?" Jerome took a slow sip of his coffee. "I'm going to test her. Something clear and simple that will show me exactly who she is." "You've got something in mind?" "Getting there," Jerome replied. "I'll call you back when I have the details worked out." After hanging up, Jerome remained in the kitchen, staring out at the backyard where he'd sat just yesterday morning, before he knew any of this. The birds were still at the feeder, the sun still warmed the porch, but everything looked different now. Sharper, clearer. His hands were steady as he picked up his coffee cup. There was no crash of rage, no urge to break things or scream. Instead, a familiar sense of focus settled over him, the same quiet determination that had helped him build everything he owned from nothing. In his mind, the pieces of a test were already taking shape. The Sunday evening settled softly around their home, carrying the warm sense of Jerome's cooking through every room. He'd prepared Adrienne's favorite, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and fresh bread. The dining room glowed with candlelight. Wine glasses caught the light just so, and everything felt perfectly normal. Jerome had maintained this careful normalcy all week. He'd gone to work as usual, smiled at the right moments, and kept his voice steady whenever Adrienne talked about her plans for redecorating the living room. Not once had he given her reason to suspect anything was different. Now, they sat together on the living room couch, dinner finished, sharing the comfortable quiet of a long-term marriage. Adrienne looked content, settled into the cushions with her second glass of wine, her guard completely down. Jerome watched her for a moment, noting how she twisted her wedding ring, a habit she'd developed lately. His own hands were steady as he set down his coffee cup. "Adrienne," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something I've been trying to handle on my own." She turned toward him, eyebrows lifting slightly. "What is it, honey?" Jerome kept his voice even, measured. "The company's in trouble. Serious trouble." "What do you mean, trouble?" Her spine straightened slightly. "We lost the federal contract, the one that makes up 40% of our revenue. There's a dispute about terms, and while we fight it, they've suspended all payments." He paused, watching her face. "That's not all. Morrison Industries pulled out completely yesterday. They're taking their business to a competitor." The warmth in Adrienne's expression began to fade, replaced by something harder to read. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I might lose everything," Jerome said softly. "The company, the house, most of our savings. I've been trying to find solutions, but—" He shook his head. "It could take years to rebuild." Her wine glass settled onto the coffee table with a sharp click. "Everything?" Her voice had changed, the gentle concern replaced by something sharper. "What exactly do you mean by everything?" Jerome noticed what she didn't ask. If he was okay? If he needed support? If they could face this together? Instead, her eyes darted around the room as if already cataloging what might be lost. "The properties would have to be sold to cover the business debts," he continued. "We'd need to downsize significantly, maybe rent for a while." "The properties?" Now there was an edge of panic in her voice. "All of them? What about your investment accounts?" Again, the wrong questions. All about assets, nothing about him. "Those too," he said. "Most of them are tied to the business in ways I can't protect." Adrienne stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Her reflection showed a woman rapidly recalculating, her carefully maintained expression cracking at the edges. "This isn't happening," she said, more to herself than to him. Then she turned, her voice rising. "Jerome, I did not sign up for broke." There it was, the truth he'd been waiting for, delivered exactly as he'd expected. "I know," he said calmly. I just needed to hear you say it." She froze. Something shifted in her eyes. The first flash of realization that she'd revealed too much. The panic of a woman who suddenly understood she might have miscalculated. The slap came fast, an open palm across his face, driven by fear and fury. The sharp crack of it echoed in the quiet room. Jerome didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He touched his jaw once, looked at her with perfect stillness, and said quietly, "Thank you. That's all I needed." Standing slowly, he picked up his coffee cup. His steps were unhurried as he walked to the bedroom. The lock clicked softly behind him. Adrienne remained in the living room, one hand still raised slightly, her breathing uneven. The candles flickered across her face as she tried to understand what had just happened, unaware that her husband's net worth remained exactly what it had always been. She had no idea that the only thing tested tonight had been her character, and she had failed spectacularly. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Jerome emerged from the bedroom, dressed for work in his usual crisp button-down and slacks. He'd slept little, but his movements were measured and controlled as he headed for the coffee maker. Adrienne stood by the kitchen island, already dressed and made up, her fingers wrapped tightly around her own coffee mug. Her practiced smile held a note of tension. "Jerome," she said softly, "about last night?" She set her mug down, taking a careful step toward him. "I overreacted. The stress of what you told me, it was just so unexpected. I never should have." She gestured vaguely at his face. "I'm so sorry." Jerome poured his coffee with steady hands, noting how she watched him, waiting to gauge his response. He turned to face her, his expression calm and open. "I understand," he said, his voice gentle. "Actually, I need to apologize too. I shouldn't have dumped all that on you without warning." He took a slow sip of coffee. "And I may have overstated the situation." Adrienne's shoulders visibly relaxed. "What do you mean?" "I spoke to some colleagues late last night," Jerome explained, the lie smooth and practiced. "The contract dispute isn't as severe as I initially thought. We have options I hadn't considered." He shook his head. "I let my fears get the better of me. I'm sorry I worried you unnecessarily." The relief that washed over Adrienne's face was almost theatrical. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "I was so worried about us, about our future." Jerome returned the embrace, noting how she said our future instead of you. His arms felt wooden around her, but his voice remained warm. "Everything's going to be fine." She pulled back, smiling up at him. "I love you." "Love you too," he replied, the words hollow in his mouth. An hour later, Jerome sat in Dwight's office, his coffee now cold and forgotten on the desk between them. The morning light cast long shadows across the polished wood as he finished explaining everything. The test, the slap, the morning's performance. Dwight leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "So we're past the testing phase." "We are," Jerome confirmed. "I need to know everything. Bank records, phone records, email accounts, anything legal that tells me how deep this goes and how long it's been planned." Dwight nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I know someone. Sandra Mitchell, private investigator, methodical, discreet, extremely thorough. She specializes in cases like this." While Dwight made the call, Jerome dialed Nadia Cross. His accountant answered on the second ring. "Nadia," he said, "I need you to begin restructuring my asset holdings. Everything by the book, fully documented, but I need maximum protection if divorce proceedings begin." "Understood," she replied without hesitation. "I'll start with the property LLCs and work through the business holdings systematically." "When do you need the initial paperwork?" "By the end of the week. You'll have it tomorrow." Jerome ended the call as Dwight finished with Sandra. "She can start immediately," Dwight said. "But Jerome, are you sure you can maintain at home? This could take weeks." "I can maintain," Jerome said quietly. Adrian thinks she managed this morning's situation perfectly. She believes I'm exactly who she's always thought I was, trusting, easily handled, unaware. That evening, Jerome sat beside Adrienne on their living room couch, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder as some reality show played on the television. Her body was relaxed against his, completely at ease. She had no idea that Sandra Mitchell was already beginning her investigation, or that Nadia was restructuring millions in assets with surgical precision. Jerome's arm draped loosely around Adrienne's shoulders as his mind reviewed the machinery now in motion. The investigators, the accountants, the careful legal groundwork being laid. His face remained perfectly neutral, betraying nothing of the calculated dismantling being orchestrated behind the scenes. On screen, someone was crying about betrayal. Adrienne made a small, sympathetic sound and nestled closer to Jerome. He squeezed her shoulder gently, the gesture automatic, empty. The late morning sun cast harsh shadows across Dwight's mahogany desk as Jerome sat down, facing both his attorney and his accountant. Sandra's manila folder lay between them, unremarkable in appearance but heavy with revelations. Jerome's hands were steady as he reached for it. "Everything's documented and verified?" he asked, though he knew Sandra's reputation for thoroughness. Dwight nodded. "Every piece admissible in court if needed." Sandra was meticulous. Jerome opened the file. The first page was a summary timeline, clinically detailing 5 years of calculated deception. His eyes moved methodically down the page, absorbing each detail with the same careful attention he gave to business contracts. Troy Billings's name appeared first, Adrienne's college boyfriend from her days at Vanderbilt. The communication records showed regular contact maintained through a series of different platforms over the years. Never quite romantic enough to qualify as an affair, but carrying an intimacy that spoke of shared secrets and future plans. The financial records came next. Bank statements revealed a pattern so subtle it had slipped past even Jerome's careful attention to their finances. Small transfers from their joint household account, $200 here, $350 there, innocuous amounts that could have been grocery runs or hair appointments. But they hadn't gone to either. Instead, they'd been systematically funneled into a private account at First Tennessee Bank, opened in Adrienne's maiden name 3 months after their wedding. $34,000 total, Nadia said quietly, pointing to the final sum. Accumulated over 4 years. She kept the individual transfers small enough to avoid any red flags. Jerome nodded, his expression unchanged. The amount itself didn't concern him. It was pocket change compared to his actual worth. But the patience it represented, the careful long-term planning, made his coffee turn bitter in his stomach. He turned the page. This section contained text message transcripts retrieved from an old phone Adrienne had traded in 6 months ago. She hadn't wiped it properly, trusting in a basic factory reset that Sandra's team had easily bypassed through legal channels. The messages to Troy laid out the strategy with startling clarity. The longer I'm married, the better position I'm in legally. 7 years, that's the number. After that, even with the prenup, I'll have claim to enough to make it worth it. He has no idea how much he's actually worth. Men like Jerome, they think keeping a low profile means they're being smart. All it does is make them easier to underestimate. 2 more years. Just need to keep things smooth for 2 more years. Then we can finally start our real life. Jerome read each message twice, his face betraying nothing. The office was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Nadia watched him with careful concern, while Dwight remained still, waiting. The final pages detailed money transfers between Adrienne and her mother Brenda. Small amounts, but regular, like payments on a contract. Jerome closed the file with the same deliberate care he'd opened it with. He sat back in his chair, drew a slow breath, and looked at his 2 most trusted advisors. "All right," he said, his voice level. "Let's start moving things." Nadia pulled out her laptop immediately. The restructuring is already in progress. The first phase of asset reallocation will be complete by Friday. Everything documented, everything legal. The prenup is solid, Dwight added. With this evidence of financial misconduct, she won't have grounds to challenge it effectively. Jerome nodded once. Keep going. I want everything locked down before she realizes anything's happening. The meeting concluded with precise next steps and timeline confirmations. No one mentioned the emotional weight of what they'd just reviewed. They didn't need to. Later, driving home in his used Ford F-150, Jerome kept the radio off. Traffic moved steadily around him as the afternoon sun began its descent, but he barely registered it. His mind was processing the full scope of what he'd learned. Not just the betrayal itself, but its architecture. 5 years of his life had been someone else's business plan. His marriage was a long-term investment strategy executed by a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than an undervalued asset to acquire. He drove in silence, his hands resting exactly where they should on the steering wheel, maintaining perfect lane position even as his world shifted permanently around him. The evening air was cooling as Jerome pulled into his mother's driveway. The small brick house where he'd grown up looked exactly as it had for 30 years. Neat flower beds, carefully trimmed lawn, porch light already on because Paulette never forgot to welcome people home properly. Before he could reach the door, it opened. Paulette stood there, still elegant at 68, her eyes sharp as they took in every detail of her son's expression. Without a word, she stepped back and said, "Come inside and sit down." The kitchen smelled like it always did. Coffee and the lingering warmth of whatever she'd baked that morning. Jerome sat at the small table where he'd done his homework as a child. Paulette poured 2 cups of coffee, added cream to his without asking, and settled across from him. "Tell me," she said simply. Jerome started with the email, his voice steady as he described finding Adrienne's accidental forward, the casual way she'd discussed manipulating him. He told her about the test, watching the warmth drain from his wife's face when she thought they'd lost everything. The slap. His mother's fingers tightened slightly on her coffee cup at that part, but she didn't interrupt. When he got to Sandra's findings, the secret account, the systematic diversion of funds, the recovered text messages laying out the 7-year plan, Paulette's expression remained calm. Only someone who knew her well would recognize the controlled anger in how still she sat. He finished with what they'd discovered about Troy, about the long game Adrienne had been playing. When he stopped speaking, the kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Paulette took exactly 3 seconds before she spoke. "I knew that woman was a contractor, not a wife." She stood up and left the kitchen. Jerome heard her footsteps on the stairs, then returning. She placed a simple black notebook on the table between them. "I've been keeping this since the first time you brought her here," Paulette said quietly. Jerome opened it. His mother's neat handwriting filled page after page with dates and observations. March 15th, 2018. Asked detailed questions about Jerome's business partners while helping me wash dishes. Wanted to know who had the most influence in decisions. June 4th, 2018. Commented on Jerome's modest truck 3 times in one conversation. Kept suggesting newer models he deserves. September 22nd, 2018. Said something odd about women who waste their youth on broke men. Context was a TV show, but she looked at me while saying it. December 12th, 2018. Asked if Jerome's father left him any property. Very casual, while helping me decorate for Christmas. 3rd time she's found a way to ask about inheritance. The entries continued, year after year. Small moments, careful questions, comments that seemed innocent but carried weight in hindsight. Paulette had documented it all, building a timeline of calculation that started before the wedding and never really stopped. "I didn't say anything," Paulette said softly, watching him read. "You were happy, and I knew if I pushed, she'd just work harder to convince you I was being a difficult mother-in-law." so I wrote it down instead. Figured someday, either I'd be wrong and could burn this notebook with joy, or you'd be right, and I'd need to see it," Jerome finished, turning another page. "A mother knows," Paulette said simply. "The way she looked at you, like she was measuring something. Real love doesn't measure." Jerome read through several more pages, each entry adding another piece to the puzzle he was finally seeing clearly. His mother had caught every false note, every calculated moment, every subtle probe for information about his finances. When he finally closed the notebook, Paulette reached across the table and took his hand. "What do you need from me?" "There's going to be a dinner," he said, "in the next few weeks. I'd like you there. You tell me when." "I'll be there." They talked a while longer, not about Adrian, but about work, about his plans, about normal things. When Jerome finally stood to leave, Paulette walked him to the door and hugged him tight. She held on a moment longer than usual, the way she used to when he was young and hurting but trying not to show it. The drive home was quiet, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across the dashboard. Paulette's notebook sat on the passenger seat. 5 years of careful observation, proving what a mother had known from the first moment she'd watched a woman measuring her son's worth. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Dwight's office as Jerome reviewed the final preparations. The leather chair creaked softly as he leaned forward, studying the single page Nadia had prepared. The number at the bottom, his actual net worth, would rewrite everything Adrian thought she knew about their marriage. "All assets have been properly restructured," Nadia said, her precise tone matching her immaculate appearance. "Everything is documented and legally sound. The timing works perfectly with the prenuptial terms." Dwight nodded, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The divorce filing is ready. I'll submit it first thing tomorrow morning. Sandra's complete file is attached as supporting documentation." He paused, studying his oldest friend. "You're sure about the timing?" "Tonight," Jerome said quietly. 5 years is enough." They went through the logistics one final time. Paulette would arrive at exactly 7:45, giving Jerome 45 minutes with Adrian first. Dwight would keep his phone close, ready to handle any legal questions that arose. The prenuptial agreement, which Adrian had signed without careful review, convinced it wouldn't matter, would activate specific clauses based on documented financial misconduct. "Remember," Dwight said, "let her talk. The more she says, the more we can use." Jerome stood, straightening his jacket. "I appreciate both of you. This isn't just business for me anymore. This is about truth." Back home, Jerome moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm. He'd chosen to cook himself. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. The table was set with their best dishes, candles ready to be lit. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked normal. He'd called Adrian at lunch, voice warm with practiced sincerity. "I've been thinking," he'd said. "We need a reset. Just us. Dinner at home. A chance to really talk. Get back to being transparent with each other." Her response had been immediate, enthusiastic. "That sounds wonderful, baby. I'll be home by 6:30. Now, as the afternoon light softened into evening, Jerome moved through each step with precision. The food was timed perfectly. The wine was breathing. Nadia's document waited in his jacket pocket, ready to reshape reality with a single page of numbers. At exactly 6:25, he heard Adrienne's key in the door. She entered smiling, still wearing the cream silk blouse and tailored slacks she'd left in that morning. "It smells amazing in here." Jerome met her with a kiss on the cheek. "Welcome home." "Wine?" "Please." She settled at the table, taking in the candles, the careful presentation. "This is lovely, Jerome. Really lovely." He poured her favorite red wine, watching her relax into the moment. She looked beautiful. She always did. That had been part of the performance from the beginning, he now understood. Every detail calculated for maximum effect. They began eating, the conversation flowing easily. Jerome asked about her day, listened to her stories about client meetings and lunch plans. She was animated, engaged, completely at ease. She had no idea that Sandra had documented every meeting, every lunch, every carefully orchestrated interaction that advanced her longer game. The salmon was perfect, the vegetables roasted just right. Jerome watched Adrienne take small, elegant bites, sipping her wine between comments about how nice this was, how they needed more evenings like this. Each word landed differently now that he knew their weight. At 7:30, right on schedule, Jerome refilled their wine glasses. Adrienne was fully relaxed now, cheeks slightly flushed, gesturing as she told a story about her afternoon. The candlelight caught her wedding ring, the one she'd insisted needed to be upgraded last year. "How's your mother doing?" Jerome asked casually, cutting another piece of salmon. "Have you talked to Brenda lately?" "Oh, she's well." Adrienne smiled, taking another sip of wine. "I was just talking to her yesterday, actually. She sends her love." Jerome nodded, setting his fork down deliberately. The sound of silver against china seemed suddenly loud in the quiet room. "I know," he said simply. Adrienne's smile stayed fixed in place, perfect as always. But something flickered behind her eyes, a quick, sharp shadow of uncertainty that came and went so fast, most people would have missed it. But Jerome had been watching for it, and now he saw everything. The candlelight flickered across Adrienne's face as the silence stretched between them. Her wine glass sat forgotten, the red liquid catching the flame's glow like trapped blood. "What exactly do you mean, you know?" Her voice aimed for casual, but landed somewhere else entirely. Jerome reached inside his jacket, movements unhurried and precise. "I know about the email you accidentally forwarded to our shared household account 3 weeks ago. The one to your mother about working on me to get access to the investment accounts." The color drained from Adrienne's face so gradually it was almost beautiful to watch, like time-lapse photography of a sunset in reverse. "I also know about Troy Billings," Jerome continued, his voice steady and clear. "Your college boyfriend, the one you never stopped texting, the one you told about your 7-year plan." "Jerome, whatever you think you've found," Adrienne started, but he raised his hand slightly, not commanding, just indicating there was more to say. "Over the past 4 years, you've diverted $34,000 from our joint household account into a personal account I wasn't meant to know about. Small amounts, careful amounts. But they add up, don't they?" Adrienne's hands were perfectly still on the table, too still, like a prey animal trying to avoid detection. "Those transfers were for household expenses. I kept receipts." "No," Jerome said simply. "They weren't." He removed the single page from his jacket and placed it on the table between them. "This is what I'm actually worth, Adrienne. The real number. Not the one you've been trying to calculate for 5 years." She stared at the document. Her eyes widened slightly as she processed the figure at the bottom. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "You were playing a smaller game than you thought," Jerome said quietly. The fracture in her composure started at the corners of her mouth, a tiny tremor that spread outward like cracks in glass. This is circumstantial. You're taking things out of context. A few text messages, some banking mistakes." "I have the full text message history," Jerome interrupted gently. "The ones where you laid out the whole plan. 7 years of marriage to establish maximum claim before filing for divorce. Your words, Adrienne. Your timeline." Her face transformed then, fear crystallizing into rage. "So you investigated me? Hired someone to spy on me? Treated your wife like some kind of suspect?" Her voice rose with each question. "How dare you violate my privacy like this? How dare you—" "You can stop performing now," Jerome said. His tone wasn't cruel. If anything, it was almost kind. The audience already knows the ending. The doorbell chimed through the house, right on schedule. Jerome stood smoothly. That would be my mother. Adrian's head snapped up. Your mother? What is this? Jerome opened the front door. Paulette stood there in her good coat, her face set in lines of quiet determination. She entered without a word, following Jerome to the dining room. She took the chair directly across from Adrian without removing her coat. I want to watch you explain yourself, Paulette said simply. Adrian opened her mouth, closed it. The silence stretched. The divorce papers will be filed first thing tomorrow morning, Jerome said, his voice steady and clear. Because of the documented financial fraud, the secret account, the diverted funds, and because of the asset restructuring already completed, you'll receive the minimum required by state law. Nothing more. He tapped the prenuptial agreement she'd signed 5 years ago, which lay beside Nadia's net worth document. You should have read this more carefully. It protected me completely, right from the beginning. You just didn't think it mattered because you planned to be gone before it became relevant. Adrian sat frozen, staring at the papers in front of her. The candles burned lower, wax pooling at their bases. Paulette watched her with the steady gaze of a woman who had been waiting years for this moment. Jerome stood and began gathering the dinner plates. His movements were calm, unhurried. The quiet clink of china was the only sound in the room as he stacked them carefully, already moving forward into whatever came next. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jerome's kitchen as he reviewed the divorce papers one final time. Dwight sat across from him, methodically checking each page before adding it to the filing stack. Everything's in order, Dwight said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of work done precisely. I'll file these within the hour. She'll be served by noon. Jerome nodded, finishing his coffee. And the 30-day notice? Already prepared. Dwight slid a sealed envelope across the table. Clear, legal, and completely by the book. She has until the end of next month to relocate. The envelope felt heavy in Jerome's hand, though it contained only a single page. He placed it on the kitchen counter where Adrian would find it when she emerged from the guest room where she'd spent the night. Within 2 weeks, Adrian's carefully constructed world dissolved like sugar in rain. She found a small apartment across town, the kind of place she would have dismissed as beneath her just months ago. Now she signed the lease with hands that trembled slightly, the depleted balance of her secret account barely covering the security deposit. Her designer clothes disappeared into consignment shops. The weekly spa appointments stopped. The lunches where she'd casually dropped Jerome's credit card vanished. The lifestyle she'd curated evaporated, leaving behind only the bare bones of what she could sustain alone. Troy Billings, when faced with an Adrian who exited her marriage with far less than planned, proved exactly as loyal as Jerome expected. His texts grew shorter, his calls less frequent. When she finally reached him directly, his voice carried the distant politeness of a man backing away from a bad investment. I just think it's best if we take some space, he said. You understand. The line clicked dead before she could respond. On a Wednesday morning, Brenda Fowler's number appeared on Jerome's phone. He answered, settling into his office chair. Jerome, please, Brenda began, her voice thick with practiced maternal concern. You have to understand. We never meant to hurt you. Adrian loves you in her way. She's young, she made mistakes, but destroying her like this? Taking everything? That's not the man I know you to be. He let her continue, listening as she cycled through guilt. After all we've shared as family. Negotiation. We can find a compromise that works for everyone. And finally, veiled threats. You don't want this getting messy in public. When she finished, Jerome spoke once, his voice clear and final. Brenda, you raised your daughter to hunt men. I'm not a man you could hunt. Don't call this number again. The phone clicked silent in his hand. 3 days before Adrian's planned departure, Paulette requested a final conversation. They sat in the living room, most of the furniture already gone. The afternoon light harsh and revelatory through uncurtained windows. Paulette opened her notebook, her voice steady and factual. October 12th, 5 years ago. At Jerome's birthday dinner, you asked about his investment strategy before you asked for a second slice of cake. December 3rd, you spent 40 minutes on the phone with your mother immediately after Jerome mentioned expanding the logistics company. February 17th, you suggested separate vacations the same week Jerome had to delay buying that third property. She continued, each entry a small, precise cut. Dates, times, words quoted exactly. 5 years of careful observation laid out like evidence in a courtroom. Adrienne sat motionless, her face a blank canvas as Paulette read page after page of who she really was, reflected back at her through another woman's eyes. When Paulette finished, Adrienne opened her mouth, then closed it. What could you say to someone who had watched you so clearly, who had documented your every calculated move, and was now simply reading the record back to you without judgment or anger? The silence stretched between them like a verdict. On the final morning, Adrienne loaded the last box into her car. The trunk closed with a hollow sound that echoed across the driveway. Jerome stood on the porch, watching as she walked around to the driver's side door. She paused with her hand on the handle, as if waiting for something. Final words, perhaps, or some sign of regret. Jerome remained still, his face composed. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only the clean, hollow quiet of something finally finished. The car started. The wheels crunched on gravel. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the settling dust and the long shadows of morning stretching across an empty driveway. Morning sunlight spilled across Jerome's new porch, painting warm stripes across the rich wooden boards. His coffee steamed in the crisp air as he settled into a handcrafted rocking chair, one he'd bought simply because he liked it, with no concern for what anyone else might think. The house behind him stood proud against the sky, 3 stories of brick and glass, with wide windows and a wraparound porch that spoke of permanence and peace. It was everything his old house wasn't, not deliberately modest, not carefully understated, but honestly reflective of the life he'd built, the kind of home he'd always wanted but had been afraid to claim, fearing what visible success might attract. Jerome took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the quiet. 18 months had transformed more than just his address. Attaway Logistics had doubled its revenue, expanding into 3 new states, with a fleet of trucks that bore the company's redesigned logo. The growth hadn't been accidental. It came from finally allowing himself to think bigger, to build without constraint. His new business partner, Michelle Chen, had been key to that expansion. She'd approached him at a logistics conference with sharp questions and sharper insights, challenging his assumptions about market penetration in ways that made him sit up and take notice. Their partnership was everything his marriage hadn't been: professional, mutually respectful, and rooted in shared vision rather than hidden agendas. The dating scene had surprised him most of all. He'd met Catherine at a community investment forum where they were both speaking about sustainable urban development. She'd argued with his points about traffic flow patterns, completely unimpressed by his presence and entirely focused on the issues at hand. It wasn't until their third date, sharing plates at a small Vietnamese restaurant, that he finally mentioned his actual financial position. Catherine had paused with her chopsticks halfway to her mouth, considered the information for exactly 2 seconds, then asked, "Have you seen that new documentary about urban beekeeping? The one about rooftop hives?" They'd spent the next hour debating the feasibility of citywide pollinator corridors. When he told Dwight about her over lunch last week, his friend had simply set down his fork and said, "That's the one." Coming from Dwight, who had watched Jerome's life implode and rebuild, it carried the weight of prophecy. The Sunday dinners with Paulette had become sacred ritual. She arrived each week with new recipes to try, filling his kitchen with the sense of childhood and the sound of stories he'd never heard about his father. Not once in 18 months had she mentioned Adrienne or said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Her presence every Sunday said everything about loyalty and love that needed saying. Jerome's office, a warm space lined with books and sun-catching windows, held one distinctive piece of art. The framed prenuptial agreement page hung beside his degrees, Dwight's idea of a birthday present. It wasn't displayed as a trophy or a warning, but as a quiet reminder that protection doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like careful paperwork, patient documentation, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions before they become crucial ones. Word about Adrienne came occasionally through mutual acquaintances. She'd landed a part-time position coordinating corporate events in a city 2 states away. The salary barely covered a 1-bedroom apartment and basic expenses, the kind of life she'd spent years carefully plotting to escape. She never spoke about Jerome publicly, never explained what happened. Some humiliations were too precise, too perfectly engineered to survive retelling. Jerome stood from the rocking chair and moved inside to his kitchen, where morning light played across granite countertops he'd chosen himself. Coffee in hand, he stood at the window, watching sunlight creep across his carefully tended yard. A memory of the slap flickered through his mind, not with anger or bitterness, but almost with gratitude. In that single second of uncontrolled reaction, she'd given him every answer he needed. Everything that followed, the investigation, the documentation, the quiet legal preparations, had simply been patience given structure. He'd learned that revenge wasn't about dramatic gestures or public humiliation. True justice was about letting someone's own choices become their consequence. He thought about his mother's words from dinner last night. "You know what I love about this house? It looks like you. Not who you were trying to be, just you." Setting down his coffee mug, Jerome picked up his keys from the counter. A full day waited ahead. Meetings to drive growth, not protect against loss. Partnerships built on shared vision, not hidden motives. A life measured by what he was building, not what he was hiding. The morning light caught the keys in his hand, gleaming like promise. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.